right. Welcome everyone to the Global Business Leaders Forum, leading not-for-profits through 2020 and beyond, COVID-19 and cultural change. First, we wanted to share a really great quote, relevant especially during these times. They say that some of the world's greatest inspirations come in times of necessity. So these wise words from Churchill are important to remember. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Now I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. First up, we have Dr. Ken Thiessen. Ken has a doctoral degree in specializing in organizational systems. He brings a wealth of diverse experiences to the table. Ken is also the author of The Entrepreneurial Nonprofit, The Key to Maximizing Sustainable Impact. Next, I'd like to introduce Nancy Batterman. Nancy brings a unique combination of perspective, experience, and education to help her clients develop effective business strategies and grow their organizations in a sustainable way to perform at their highest level of success. And finally, I'd like to introduce Adam Tenner. Adam has over 20 years of experience as a leader in social sector. He's raised over $50 million in resources and has been the recipient of the Champion of Change by the Obama White House, as well as given the Ryan White Service Award by the National Education Association. So welcome Nancy, Ken, and Adam. We're excited to have you with us today. Most people, when they think of nonprofits, don't realize that they often struggle with the same challenges or uncertainties as for-profit companies. Leaders of both types of organizations are working to deliver on their purpose during these uncertain times. The biggest challenge is often that the need for services that nonprofits provide is continually increasing. And when it comes to revenue, while some organizations are seeing no changes or increases in revenue, some nonprofits are facing declines. And the difficulty that the nonprofit customers aren't generally the consumers of services of these nonprofits. Other organizations, such as schools, may see additional funding, but are having to pivot operations in order to provide virtual learning. Another area becoming increasingly challenging for leaders is what's happening in our world as we struggle to address issues of social justice, diversity, and inequality. Many leaders are feeling pressure, whether it's internal or external. This itself could be a topic that had its own webinar, but I just wanted to acknowledge the historic time that we are in. COVID and cultural evolution have leaders around the world and in North America looking for answers. We won't get into all of the economic and social issues today, but we hope to create a conversation with 3 of our coaches about how they are supporting their nonprofit clients through this time. Today, our panelists will cover solutions for planning and uncertainty, how to leverage your strategic partnerships and mergers, and how to align your team, which is becoming even more critical in this remote environment. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so go ahead and send your questions in the chat so we can answer them. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Nancy. I'm just going to ask you to unmute yourself, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Michaela, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to talk about planning in uncertainty. So planning is never easy. I think we can all agree to that. And in uncertain times, maybe we should just decide not to plan at all. Is that really the right strategy? Have you ever found a good time to plan? I haven't really. I wish I could, but there doesn't seem to be a really good time to plan. So a plan helps us clarify where we're going. It gives everyone in the organization the direction they need. And in uncertain times, I think we need more direction and to help our staff feel more comfortable in knowing where we're going. A plan helps us clarify where we're going, and it's even more important to do that in uncertainty. Planning provides your team with direction, focus, and stability. The trick is to keep that plan flexible and be willing to change it as things change. And I think we can all agree that now there's more change than ever, and things seem to be changing every other week, if not sooner than that. So flexibility is key. Communication is also important. Communication is even more important in uncertainty, and we never can communicate too much. It's very important to communicate your plan to your staff. Once you've got that plan, you want to be able to communicate it with them. You also want to be accessible to your staff, your stakeholders, so that they can provide you feedback. This is also an opportunity for staff to share their fears and concerns. With all of this uncertainty, you want to give your staff the opportunity to be able to share those fears and concerns. It's most important that you're a good listener. In most cases, they don't even really expect your feedback, but just want to know that they're being heard at this critical time. So listening is a key component to communication. It's also important to hear from and know what your core customers are doing and thinking. And actually, I think the word stakeholder is a better descriptor of our core customer, because in most cases, nonprofits have multiple stakeholders: clients, potentially their families, funders, donors, board members, and strategic partners are all key stakeholders. And once again, it's really important to share with them your plan. They want to know the direction you're going and what your plans are, particularly when things are so uncertain. And this gives them confidence. And you really, most importantly, want your funders and your donors to have confidence in your organization, particularly when there's so much more demand for services for nonprofits right now. It's also critical to know the characteristics and qualities of your stakeholders. The better you know your stakeholders, the better you'll be able to serve them, especially when things are changing so quickly. So the key themes here are planning, communication, and listening are all important things, but even more critical in uncertain times. So let me share an example with you. One of my clients is a non-public school, special education school, and we did our planning in May, like we typically do, our 2-day strategic planning. And we sat down to do our annual initiatives, the top initiatives, priorities for the year. They talked about, because they had just been starting to use virtual learning, of course, but they were really thinking that they were going to be able to move into summer school with kids coming back to the classroom. So there was quite a bit of discussion about virtual learning, and the feeling was that they probably weren't going to have to worry too much about virtual learning in the future. So we didn't include it in their strategic plan for the upcoming year. Well, when we met for our monthly meeting in June, before our fiscal year started, it starts in July, but there was a lot of discussion because things had changed drastically. And in fact, summer school was not going to happen in person. And there was another big change that they were going to go to distance learning, and distance learning was going to probably happen in the fall as well. So they had to make a quick change to their plan and added a new initiative for the year on distance learning. In fact, it was a pretty comprehensive conversation about the new goal was to create a comprehensive distance learning platform that includes training, security, IT, curriculum, parent support, equipment, and policies. So it really was a big initiative. So Michaela, do we have a copy of the growth roadmap? So I wanted to show this. If you work with a Gravitas Impact Premium Coach, you're very familiar with the growth roadmap or the one-page strategic plan. But if you aren't, I encourage you to seek out a Gravitas Impact Coach to talk with them. This is a critical tool. This is the reason that I became involved with Gravitas in the 7 attributes of agile growth. One of the weaknesses for most nonprofits is their strategic planning process. And for me, throughout my career, I looked for an effective strategic planning process. And this is the one I found. In most cases, and I think this is similar for a lot of nonprofits, you do a lot of talking, you put together a comprehensive nonprofit strategic plan, in most cases 30, 40 pages, you put it in a ring binder and stick it on a shelf. And the next time you look at it is when you have to do it all over again in 2 or 3 years. And that's what I like about the 7 attributes of Agile Growth Roadmap, is if you look at the far left-hand column under foundations, you see this is the foundations of your nonprofit. That middle next section is your strategy, looking out to the future. And then you have 1-year initiatives and quarterly priorities. The quarterly priorities part of this is your action plan for the next year. And you look at each quarter and you're looking at your plan at least on a monthly basis and executing your priorities. but you're looking at it in most cases on a weekly basis. And that's what really makes this such an effective process. So I really encourage nonprofits to seek out more information about this one-page strategic plan. But the bottom line is you just got to do it and do your planning even in uncertain times.
Okay, so I want to talk about pivoting your organization. I don't know of any nonprofit that hasn't had to pivot given the start of COVID. Client that I was working with, I'd been working with them about 6 months when COVID hit. The CEO was new in the role. She had taken over from a retired CEO, and they were just getting ready to launch a new program. They've got a bunch of government funding for a new program, getting ready to hire their team for this new program and get it launched. And COVID hit, and as you can imagine, they overnight their world changed. And I think that's true of a lot of nonprofits, is that it caught them by surprise, and they had to make some quick changes in terms of their operations. And this particular client that I'm working with, they run a residential program for people struggling with mental health and addiction issues. And so overnight they went into full lockdown mode, and a lot of their management team started working remotely from home, which was a new experience for them because they were all used to being in the same office building. And that all changed overnight, and they had to put in security protocols to protect their staff and their residents from COVID. So next slide, Michaela, if you can move to the next slide, just talk about some things that they had to consider. So one of the challenges in the middle of a pandemic is when you've got to make pivots is to be strategic and not reactive. And so this client, they had to make some changes in their program, and some of their revenue model changed. They had to pivot on that because some of their funding sources weren't as accessible as they were before. And so, yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of times when we get into a crisis, we tend to be reactive. And as Nancy was talking about, the key thing is to be strategic and to take a step back. And so one of the pivots we had to make is I was meeting with them face to face, and we had to pivot to online. So we were doing Zoom sessions, and the CEO wasn't sure how that was going to work. And actually it turned out working very, very well. But it was, it was a change. And one of the good things that really helped them through the process is that we'd been working on developing their one-page plan, and so a lot of the foundational pieces were already in place, and the leadership team was all on the same page. Which, as we went through it, we found out that was really one of the keys for them kind of coming through it better than most nonprofits. And so we did that. So if you can hit the next bullet there, Michaela, please. One of the key things is that, and I've seen this in my work with nonprofits over the last 10 years, is that a lot of times nonprofits don't learn from some of the crises that come along. And so back in 2008 and 2009, whether in the US or in Canada like me, I mean, we were hit, nonprofits were hit hard. And so the opportunity with crisis is to say, what can we learn? And one thing that's really key is that you've got a healthy team, your leadership team, and that you've got the right people on the team. And I don't know about you, but different people respond to change differently and pivoting. I tend to be a change agent, but not everybody is like that. And do you have the right people on your team in order to make the pivot, so that you actually come out the other side of the pivot stronger? And do you have the capacity to pivot? And you don't want to pivot just for the sake of pivoting. If you're going to make a pivot, does it fit with the core competencies of your organization? Does it fit with your strengths? And do you have a plan in place for succession planning. And if you come out the other side, and not everybody, you don't have everybody. Not everybody came through the pivot and survived the change, but and do you have a system in place for change management? Because change is hard, and for, like I said, to have systems in place for change management and managing that change well is really key. And so as I was working with this client, I mean, a lot of what we talked about is I said to them, I said, okay, what lessons are you? And they were more prepared going in than most of the clients I've worked with. And that's because they had a good risk management strategy. So we talked a lot about what worked, and if they were to do it over again, what would they do differently? And it was a great opportunity for them to kind of reflect back and say, okay, what have we learned? What's worked? Why did it work? What didn't work? And where I live up in Canada, I mean, our city, what they did is their emergency management thing set up weekly calls for a lot of these nonprofits to get on a Zoom call and talk about what they were doing. And so there was a lot of collaboration that happened in the context of these different agencies, which in the end turned out to be a really good thing, because they were all on the same page, and the city was helping them put in place the pieces that they needed to minimize the impact of COVID on their organizations and the people that they were serving. So
okay, thanks, Ken. Great, so we're going to talk a little bit about strategic alliances, and you can go ahead and advance. Michaela, thank you. Can you put to the next slide? There we go, thanks. So just by way of a little background, I was a nonprofit CEO for 15 years and have served in leadership positions in nonprofits for, including boards, for the past 20-something years. And while I was executive director of the last organization I ran, we went through 3 strategic alliance conversations with other organizations. And since that time, I've done another 6. So it's been a very interesting process, and one I realize that a lot of us don't really spend a lot of time talking about when we're strong or when we're not. I think that the discussion around strategic alliance, or really mergers, there is no actually such thing as mergers anymore from a legal perspective, or people generally don't. They're usually asset transfers. But the strategic alliance or merger conversation can be fairly fraught for organizations. We tend to avoid those conversations. But I love this Peter Drucker quote, and I really like the focus on, which it really is like, what's the right action that we need to do, and keeping our purpose for front and center is really how we drive those purpose-driven discussions. Okay, next. Yeah, so I just wanted to put this up just as a second that these are some of the natural places where organizations would look for strategic alliance opportunities. I'm not gonna, any of these could be happening in our current situation where things are changing very rapidly. We're either trying to start something new, or we're trying to catch up, or trying to figure out how we're going to pivot, like Ken spoke about. And you can go to the next one. So, this moment really provides a lot of natural opportunities. The most common call I get when groups come talk and want to hear a little bit more about what strategic alliance process looks like, and often those can be even clandestine, sort of Romeo and Juliet conversations of like, will you meet us on the steps of this building and not tell our boards that we're here, kind of things. It generally, the most urgent thing is usually around sustainability. We're not sure if we can make this work. We need to figure out a plan for our mission. And I think, again, the most important decision is around the delivering on our purpose and mission, and our ability to continue to do that in a way that's that we can deliver impact and sustainability. I think Ken and Nancy talked a lot about some of the strategy work that can be done, the pivoting, really doing good planning, really thinking about, how do we manage our cash? What can we do to really get our expenses under control or to increase revenue? This is a slightly different conversation. I think, though, that for people who want to consider how they can reduce their overhead, who want to find a safe harbor for their work if they're worried that their missions are in jeopardy, strategic alliance may very well be the right conversation for them. Next slide. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a map of when we're talking about strategic alliance. We often think about mergers or these asset transfers, but there's actually kind of a, you don't have to start there, nor do you have to end there. I think generally what's most salient to people who call is that bottom line, which is really around ownership and control. Like, I really love the organization and my mission. I feel ownership of it. If I'm partnered with someone, will I lose control? I can do it better than other people, the kind of social service martyrdom that sometimes comes up. But I also want to really highlight that vertical line around considering when we're looking to either decrease costs or administrative costs, or looking for opportunities to really be more efficient, that strategic alliances can also be, can be very fruitful. For most organizations, the merger or asset transfer transaction is usually where things end, but it really doesn't have to. And it can really just start, and I'll talk more about this, really just in the place of collaboration. Like, how can we do programs together? What are the opportunities? Hey, do you have a good bookkeeper? Can we talk about how we could be working with you on the bookkeeper? The parent subsidiary model is the one that people often get the most interested in, I find, in the middle of these processes. And I just want to say that that is a completely viable model. It's generally for very large organizations. So the typical example would be the hospital, who also has a rehab attached to the hospital, and they're separate entities. But one's the parent, one's subsidiary, and there's a lot of lawyerly rules that need to go into that. Anyway, it's worth asking more questions about, but we're not going to go into that now. Okay, next one. I think what's really most critical for organizations is to have the conversation, and this is a great time to do it. I think the thing that ends up hard, and for a lot of people, and this was including me, that sometimes the strategic alliance conversation can feel a bit like failure, especially if you're the organization you're not seeing the sustainability that you really want. I always say that executive directors and CEOs tend to be the people who can untie any knots, but there are some knots, and this moment presents a number of them, that are not always so easy to untie. And that's why it's so critical to remain purpose-driven and making sure that we're stay very, very focused on the people that we're delivering the service for or delivering the benefit for, so that we can do what's best for them. The next one, yeah. Yep, there we go. So this merger thing can be kind of a bad word, and there can be a lot of stigma associated for some organizations. Again, I think a lot of my work when I'm facilitating these processes is to remind everybody who we're doing this for, so that the conversation, that while it's not the sexy kind of leadership that makes the 9 o'clock news because you've, defined a cure for a disease, or you've, planting the flag at the top of the hill, it is a really important part of leadership when we're talking about protecting the communities that we're set up to serve. And just as one example, one of the organizations that I work with, the executive director really took to the conversation. So both she ended up having that conversation with her close colleagues, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Regularly, it made them uncomfortable, but she tried to work very hard to normalize those conversations to say, I'm not saying that we need to, I'm just saying we should consider it. What would be the upsides? What would be the downsides? What would be the challenges? She normalized those conversations with a number of partners. And in fact, just a few months ago, I should say, in the board, in our strategic planning work, also really got more comfortable talking about that as a strategic option. It wasn't anybody's preferred option, but it was to talk about if they were an advocacy organization, and sometimes advocacy money is hard to raise, really trying to dig in to say, how could we maximize this? Because they're not going to fund all of our local organizations doing advocacy work with everything we want. And they just completed a really smooth transition with another youth advocacy organization, and it's really extraordinary. They've done a really great job. Next one. So I think in my work, and what I hope that people will walk away from this, is that really for leadership teams, leaders and boards, to consider strategic alliance at every opportunity, to really see it as an opportunity that if at the end of the day is not really obviously to make lots and lots of money, although we should make a profit to increase our long-term sustainability, but that really it's about the purpose that we were founded to do. And when we have that conversation, we can have more rich conversations about what the options are. I really encourage people to reach out to organizations that may have, you might be a very strong organization and you want to increase your capabilities. You want to expand into a certain new line. You want to do some of the pivoting that Ken talked so eloquently about. Right, this is an opportunity to consider looking at what other organizations are around who do that well, who may just be struggling with a resource issue or where you might be a good fit. Also to really make friends who, with the leaders of the other organizations who are mission adjacent, right? Where our work is very complementary, where we may even have some overlap. Again, entering into that danger zone to have those uncomfortable zones, to have those important conversations. And the other critical thing is to really have those conversations about important partnerships early. The thing that happens occasionally is that people come when it's too late. There are two deal killers for strategic alliances. There tend to be one is legal action. So once the organization is really beset by too much legal action, the other one is debt. So I really encourage organizations to say, don't wait till the last minute. Get out there early while you're strong and make that, when you have money in the bank, you're going to be a more attractive partner if you're the potentially being acquired. I recently have read an article about this idea and it's sort of relevant to this kind of social justice moment, that there really aren't safe spaces, but there are only brave spaces. And I think for leaders, like talking about strategic alliance is a brave space to jump into. For board members and for executive directors or CEOs, how to get out there and really have those brave conversations so that we can really do what's best in delivering on our mission and our promise to the community. Yeah, that's it. We just, I want you all to be brave. Back to you, Michaela.
All right, thank you, Nancy, Ken, and Adam. So this is our Q&A time. For all of you listening in, this is a great time. Just chat your questions that you have for Nancy, Ken, and Adam in the chat so we can answer them. But to start with, what do you recommend as the first step nonprofit organizations can take after leaving this webinar?
Well, I'll, kind of repeat what I said. If you haven't sat down with your team and done some planning, I would do some planning in the next couple of weeks. Talk about kind of where the changes are going on in your organization and what things you need to put in place to kind of move forward with some direction and some purpose.
Adam, Ken, any other comments?
Yeah, I just, Ken, you're on mute.
I would agree with Nancy. As a lot of the nonprofits I've connected with, they feel they don't have the time to plan, but actually, this is probably the most important time to plan because nobody knows when COVID's going to end, and you want to be thoughtful when you come out the other side, and so take some time to make the investment to plan. And it is an investment that will reap huge benefits for the organization and for the people that nonprofits are trying to serve.
I would just add to that I think with a few of my clients, there's so much uncertainty that even just helping them to break it into smaller chunks, to say, like, with two organizations, I'm really just saying, like, okay, what should things look like in December 2021? Let's not try to get the 3 years out. It's hard enough to figure out what the December 2020 is going to look like. So let's just stretch a little bit and say, at the other end of this, ideally, what do we want to look like? And I think for some people that's felt a little bit easier than trying to forecast further out.
Yep, I think you really need to sit down and talk with your staff, and if they have questions, give them an opportunity to ask questions and to really address the uncertainty that they may have and do the best job as a leader of answering those questions. But you want to alleviate some of the uncertainty and give them some direction and some confidence that things are going to be better in the future.
Nancy, that's a great lead into our next question. If your team is not well aligned now, what are some strategies you can do to change that, especially while there is all this uncertainty?
Yeah, I say it's a really good time to work on your team, to do some team building. I think one of the tools that a lot of us use are the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and to really go through those 5 dysfunctions and talk about them with your team. Do some team assessments and find the best way to work with each other. Those are all key things that you want to do. And anytime you want to have a strong, healthy, well-aligned team.
Adam, any comments on the team alignment?
Yeah, the thing that I found that came up time and time again with the organization my client that I was working with, is we had worked really long and hard on their core values, and they had incorporated their core values into their hiring process. And they talked about time and time again about how much that made a difference for not only the leadership team, but they reinforced those core values of their frontline workers. And they had very little drama in the organization because they were all aligned around their core values. And these weren't just slogans. These were behaviors that they were living out. And that really made a difference. It made a difference in that they were all on the same page.
Adam, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think those are great answers. I did want to say, Michaela, there was a note that came in through the chat from Adam Siegel, asking about how are your clients seeking new sources of funding in the lockdown minimal travel environment, which it's harder to build new relationships, what's worked and what hasn't.
That's a great question.
So I'll just try to jump out first. I think there's a few things. So one is that there's a lot of evidence in the literature now that if organizations are trying to grow, that if you're really good at individual donor work, if you really want to grow, do more individual donor work. If you're really good at grant work or government contract work, really focus on that. Do the thing that is really your core competency when it comes to revenue generation. And I've seen that's been very effective for some of the clients that I work with now, to really try to reach out and to deepen the relationships that they currently have, whether it's with formal philanthropy or individual donors, and then try to figure out how to deepen those relationships over Zoom. It's not ideal. But I think folks have found some effectiveness in just digging into the place. So I think one is the relationship building, but 2 is really to dig in on the thing that you're already really good at, rather than if you've not been very good at grants, but you're really good at major donor, don't start writing more grants, double down on your donors. I don't know if other people have had different.
Well, coming back to the client that I was working with, what they found is they had some other agencies that stepped up with extra funding for them. So the United Way had gotten a whole bunch of funding from the Canadian government, and they started to distribute some of that money to some of the agencies that were doing good work in the community. And they found this from some other organizations too, who stepped up and said, hey, we want to support what you're doing and know that you've got extra costs. And we're prepared to give you some more money to help you do what you need to do.
Yeah, I think there are some opportunities, particularly if you're meeting increased demands, that a lot of the local, particularly foundations and things, are providing resources for those nonprofits that are meeting critical needs at this point. So you want to keep your eyes and ears out to those. And I reiterate what Adam said, you want to stay focused on your strengths. And this is the time to really stay focused on those and not wander off into some of those other areas just because it seems like a good idea. But I think we've all learned over time that's not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
On that note, question that came in, do you recommend that organizations try and pivot their strategies during this time?
I think it depends on what you're doing. I mean, a lot of organizations, we've all had to pivot into the virtual environment, and we haven't really had any choice in that. So I think you're going to, in some cases, be forced to make some changes. I just would suggest that you don't force any additional changes at this point, but focus on the ones that you really have to deal with. So distance learning, virtual environments, learning all of this Zoom and all of those different resources, that, got to do that for sure.
Adam, this
I would,
one's, wait, no, Ken, you go.
I was going to say, if you're going to do a pivot in the middle of this kind of a thing, I would suggest that you get somebody from the outside from your organization to help you walk through that. Because, you know, if you're inside the organization, the way systems work, you get so immersed in the system, you can't see things clearly because this is just the way things are. Whereas if you bring somebody in from the outside, they can ask different sets of questions and they probably see things that maybe you don't see. And I know one of the big benefits that my clients said they experienced was that, you know, I could ask them the tough questions, as we were meeting on Zoom. And I was a non-threatening presence there because I wasn't their boss and they could talk about the things they needed to talk about. And so, yeah, having somebody from, like Nancy was saying earlier, you know, connect with a coach of some sort, somebody who can help you walk through that process.
Adam, this question's for you. For strategic alliance and mergers, what is the difference between the board's role and the executive's role in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's been my experience that oftentimes the executive director is the person who kind of raises their hand first and says, hey, I think we need to do this, either because they're thinking about making a transition or in part just because they're out in the community talking to other directors, their colleagues and are finding opportunities. I think the tricky part about the process of strategic alliance is that it's ultimately a board decision. And so often say that and that decision is both about 50% rational and or maybe 51% rational, 49% emotional. And at the end, the final decision really is the board, and the executive director may not have a say in that. So it is ultimately a board decision. I often say to the executive directors, like, the work is probably going to be yours, and people are going to look to you to say, hey, that's, like, this is good, or like, oh my God, I saw them, kicking kittens outside. I don't think they're the right group for us.
Nancy, Ken, any comments on that? Well, this is also a board-focused question. So with any individuals who have business backgrounds are more accustomed to focusing on the bottom line, the board members can often experience discomfort when talking about profit. Do you have any suggestions around that?
I think you have to talk about it. I learned early on in my nonprofit career, no money, no mission. And so that profit is an important part of a nonprofit organization. And you want to have the financial resources to be able to do all the things and to grow in a sustainable way. So I encourage board members to really talk about profit and to get comfortable with that. And the more nonprofits can act like businesses, the more successful they're going to be. And that's going to help them, do all the things that they want to do.
I would just echo what Nancy said. I think I just got off the phone earlier with a new CFO who came from the for-profit side and was trying to figure out how to have those conversations about cost and profit. And I just encouraged her to try to stick with those words, and particularly the profit one, which can make nonprofit leaders uncomfortable. So I encourage that. And I think to your question, in particular about board members, is I think, or maybe Ken can really answer this. He was talking about the other day about how sometimes even some of his for-profit clients, when they get to the boardroom, sometimes change gears as if the nonprofits need to run very differently. I know, Ken, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, what I've seen with a number of boards that I've worked with, I mean, you've got very competent business people who end up sitting on these nonprofit boards. And it's like they park their business brains at the door when they walk in the boardroom, as if you don't need to worry about that stuff. And with some of these boards, I've just said to them, I said, you guys, you would never tolerate, and most often they're men, not being sexist, but I said, you would never tolerate this in your work life. Why do you tolerate this here? You need to bring your best expertise. And let's face it, a lot of times, you know, people, and I think I'm sure Adam and Nancy have seen this, people who end up as, you know, CEOs or EDs of nonprofits, they're good people. They care about the cause, but a lot of times they don't have the business expertise. And this is where, you know, board members have a lot to offer to the organization. And I think a lot of times, if I'm sure it's no different in the US than it is in Canada, but board members are legally liable. If they don't do their due diligence, I mean, they're on the hook legally if something goes sideways. And so, and that's where, as an outside person, I can say some of those things to a board in a way that the executive director or CEO can't, because that's their boss that they're talking to. So yeah, I mean, I think that business leaders need to bring their expertise to the table, and that's something that can be of huge value to a nonprofit organization and the leadership team.
Yep, I think one of the suggestions is to use the term margin or funding, and maybe to start out there, but over time, I think if you can start to use, you know, profit so that it becomes socially acceptable within the nonprofit environment, I think that's key.
Yeah, and I would also add to that I think Ray wrote that in that they use margin a little bit more often in Australia, and I would just say that it doesn't really matter so much what you call it. I think that this idea that profit, that cash is king, that grows out, and so we need to make sure that nonprofits are focusing on the bottom line, not just the top line. And I think, just like for-profit CEOs, sometimes we get caught up, our egos get caught up in the top line, and not so much in what's on the bottom. And so whatever you choose to call it, I think that's the important place to focus. I've often walked into nonprofits and said, boy, things must be really hard for you. And this is even as prospects. And they say, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, it must feel like an elephant sitting on your chest. And what are you talking about? And I was like, you know, you're upside down on your restricted dollars. And so that must just be really painful as you try to, you know, close payroll every month. And often people are surprised because those leaders are not really focusing on those really those really important health metrics, which include the balance of unrestricted net assets, or what are now called in the US net assets without donor restrictions. That's really the critical number. It's the first place I look to try to understand what the financial health of the organization is. So the critical part is, whatever you end up calling it, make sure you look at the bottom.
As was mentioned a little bit in the beginning, a lot of nonprofits right now are, and thank you, Ray, for your comment, whatever it's called, it's important to have a margin to invest in growth, exactly. As Nancy was saying, no money, no mission. But a lot of nonprofits are struggling right now with cash flow issues. What are some things they can do to help in a more immediate sense?
One of the tools we use is, we call it the power of one. I did this with my client, and they had all of their numbers. And so if you were to increase your giving by 1%, reduce your expenses by 1%, what would that take to your bottom line, whether you call it net income or margin? And we did that exercise, and, you know, as we were going through it, you think 1% isn't a big deal, but by the time we were done, they had added $17,000 to their bottom line just by going through that exercise and saying, okay, if we were to cut, you know, expenses here, and you can do this without in any way affecting your programs or your services. And if we were to increase our revenue by 1%, you know, what impact would that have on, you know, our cash flow and our, you know, our reserves, cash reserves?
It's a great tool.
It is a great tool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Wait, no, you go.
When we added up the numbers, they were the management team was absolutely stunned at how much money they had found. You know, and you think, well, what difference will 1% make? Well, when you accumulate it, you know, it can make a significant difference.
Do you have any tips for doing out-year planning in this current environment?
Gosh, I would say, you know, if you feel comfortable to try to do some out-year planning, I think you want to at least start to have some of the conversation and do some kind of looking at different options or opportunities. You know, what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And do, you know, some out year planning that way. You know, and just start to talk about it. So people, I mean, I think people get afraid when you don't talk about the future. So you want to be able to talk about it and talk different scenarios.
I recommend, you know, especially when we think about, you know, I recommend nonprofits do in particular 3-year budgets. So, you know, if not further out. So, you know, like for most of my clients, we're working on 2021, but then we're also going to try to put in 2022 and 23, which is super challenging. I think the important part, I think for me, is just stay consistent, right? So conservative budgeting should mean that we should look at revenue and assume that it's going to be less, and look at expenses and assume it's going to be higher. And I have found that for boards in particular, that process and seeing that on paper is also really very motivating in terms of like, okay, what kind of resources do we need to be bringing in here? And knowing that just if we say that in the out years, we know we're going to need additional cash, especially if we're doing major donor work, but even foundation work, the seeds of that need to be planted today to be able to build into that future revenue stream. So yeah, I think really you can do, I think we should be doing it as best we can, but I think we, like Nancy said earlier, we need to hold it gently, knowing that so much could happen between now and 2023.
Change and flexibility. Those are the words.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And this looks like it's the last question, unless any others come in the chat. But what can business leaders do to help not-for-profits in their local communities?
Volunteer. I think, you know, find a nonprofit you're interested in, volunteer to sit on a committee, to participate in some volunteer activity, get to know the organization, offer your expertise. I think nonprofits are always looking for good quality board members who have good, strong business, marketing, finance skills. So seek out a nonprofit and volunteer.
All right, Adam, Ken, anything to add?
I would agree with that. I think that's the key thing. I think, you know, most nonprofits are always looking for good board members who've got some expertise that they can bring to the table, who are not just there as warm bodies, but who are there because they care about the cause and they're willing to kind of bring their expertise and help the organization scale up its impact and its growth.
All right.
I think, sorry, I just would just toggle in there one more thing, which is just that I think there's other ways to consider about what help organizations might need today, especially for corporations who people have access to. Again, with all these pivots to online, you know, are there people out there, people in your company who can help with IT? You know, as people try to figure out how to make sure that we have stable communication platforms. Are there ways to donate more products to get out to families who are, you know, dealing with instability around housing, food, or supplies? And so I think there's always lots of ways. Obviously, cash is great, but business leaders to also be able to ring the bells to their colleagues and to their networks to say, like, there is always something that somebody can do to lend a hand to help move things forward. So I think it's just about finding that creativity and figuring out what is that your company or that your organization has to give, because there's for sure a recipient of whatever that gift is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Nancy, Adam, Ken. Thank you for everyone who attended and asked questions. So they have kindly provided their contact information. If you do have any follow-up questions from anything, whether it was on this webinar or anything that you didn't have the opportunity to get answered. So you can see their contact information here. And I'll just stay on this side as we close out. Ken, Adam, Nancy, do you have any additional comments you want to make?
Plan.
Plan.
Make the
Plan.
time.
I just want to say that this is a really difficult time for certain in North America, both COVID and really trying to come to grips as organizations with, issues of social justice, how organizations are going to evolve in this moment, how we respond and really rise up to positively answer some of the call that community is providing is challenging. And so I just want to acknowledge that this is a really extraordinary time and difficult time for people to be leading. And so I just want to be thankful for people who are either leading nonprofits or on the boards of nonprofits who are donating their time to do that, because it's an all hands on deck kind of moment. And so I just want to say thanks to all those folks and to my colleagues.
All right. Well, thank you again. The recording for this webinar will be shared shortly next week, and the contact information for Ken, Nancy, Adam is on the screen right here. Have a great rest of your day.